Hi, everybody. Welcome to the, I guess it's July, isn't it? The July edition of the AppNexus Engineering Scale event, or at least the first one in July. My name is Gary Magnuson, Jr. I'm a VP of Engineering here at AppNexus. And for those of you new to the series, what this is either once or twice a month, we bring in a thought leader in engineering and around that industry to share their experiences that they've had in scaling out organizations or technology or similar. If you're unfamiliar with AppNexus, how many people know what AppNexus does? Okay. I'm not in marketing, so they're going to kill me if they hear this, but we're effectively an exchange for real-time auctions for advertising. So effectively, advertisers can bid in real time for the right to put up an ad in a slot on web advertising or mobile. We do about 50 billion impression requests a day, peak at about 1.2 million requests a second. We'll do daily about 17 billion transacted auctions, so auctions that complete. And that generates 47 terabytes of data a day. So I'm telling you this because we're hiring. And if these sound like exciting problems, to work on, we have a couple of our recruiters here in-house. Are they in-house? Right, they're out-house. But they're around. You can also send us an email at tag, T-A-G, at appnexus.com. I think that stands for the Talent Acquisition Goon Squad. And they do a very good job. So one note, this is our last one for the summer. We'll be resuming in September. I'm really excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Bryzek. He's the co-founder and CTO of Gilt Groupe, and he's interesting because he was also my boss for a number of years when I worked at Gilt. As you can see, he's in fine shape. He's survived that. And how many people are Gilt members? Okay, good. That's what I expected. If you use it, you know that was a technology platform that was built to scale to handle the sales model that they have. And I have some idea of how that part worked, but I'm really excited to hear about another part that Mike tackled, which was how he took another dimension of scale, organizational scale, which in some ways is actually harder than technical scale, and how he made that as good as a technical platform. So with that, Mike Bryzek and how to truly scale a modern engineering organization.
Thanks, Gare, and thanks so much for inviting me to come here today. So actually, Gare and I met by accident, and I think it was the day I was pulling my hair out as Gilt was starting to grow, trying to figure out what to do.
And the result is I have no hair, right?
I kept my hair through the experience, thanks to Gare. And we met, we were sharing office spaces. I think you were working on what became MongoDB at the time. And Gare stopped by and kind of poked his head in and said, "Can I help?" And through that, we started to really look at ways we could scale Gilt's e-commerce business. Our goal is to do 1 million transactions per second as well. That's quite a lot of e-commerce. Not there yet. With Gare, we started looking at some of our key problems there, which is really how do we scale kind of the commerce traffic, and in our case, it's really inventory requests. So can I buy this item that's still in stock when a lot of people come in? And together we went down a route which led us to kind of NoSQL, Voldemort, and actually I learned a ton from Gare. He's an amazing engineer. And one of the metrics of an amazing engineer we now use, thanks to him, is the longevity of the systems that are built and how long they actually run correctly. And in fact, when there are errors, how easily can you prove what happened, fix it, and continue? So a lot of the systems that Gare put in place at Gilt continue to drive the core commerce platform today. Even I think one of them has been, uptime is now 5 years, I think. And it's the one that handles the majority of the traffic and the load. It's just, I mean, it's just amazing. So kudos to you, Gare. I've learned a ton from you, and thanks for inviting me here. To switch gears, so we're going to talk about scaling a modern engineering organization. And we're going to start with a hypothesis. And hypothesis is really that decentralization is the best way to scale today's engineering orgs. And I think through kind of how we structured the talk today is we're going to talk briefly about millennials and what's happening in the workplace. We're going to talk about what we've called the social experiment at Gilt, which is really what we've been doing to test this hypothesis. We'll touch on culture and policies. I'm going to highlight a few things in tech infrastructure that actually are required to decentralize and scale, I'd argue, scale an engineering organization well. today, and then we'll have some time for questions. So let's talk briefly about, and even just a little bit of more background. When starting Gilt, one of the very early thoughts was to make sure that Gilt remained a place, no matter its size, that we, and I personally, would want to join at any point in the company's history. And that comes from kind of a reflection of what do great engineers want, and how can they contribute, and how easily is it to build real value for the membership or the business. And realizing that in many large organizations, there's a challenge around process and bureaucracy, which I think for many people is a little bit stifling. As a result, if we look around, a lot of software engineers are choosing startups, either to join early stage companies or to start their own companies. And we'd argue that, or suggest that maybe a big reason why is it's just becoming harder to contribute at some of the larger organizations. And if we look around and you look at all the established companies out there and you look at what's actually driving their growth, or what they say is driving their growth, they'll use this word innovation, and innovation is funding their growth. The business may be stable, but it's the innovation that continues the drive for growth. And if you think about innovation in software coming from engineers that are motivated, and those engineers leaving to startups, then innovation will falter and then growth will falter. And so that's really what today's talk is about, and largely reflecting on the experience of Gilt. Today, Gilt is a little bit over 1,000 people. It's about 100 people writing code on a daily basis. So I want to touch briefly on a millennial. I had to look up the definition. I was luckily born in the 70s, so I missed it. But a millennial is somebody who was born in the early 80s to roughly 2000, according to, I think, Wikipedia. And I think of it really as the generation that had Netscape in high school. And the reason, we'll come back to that, but I know when I was in college, that's when Netscape hit. That's when the internet started, and I was there. I got to watch that as a student, and that was enlightening. But I had already gone through high school. I had to go to the library and a bunch of those other things, whereas millennials didn't, because the internet existed and the information was there, and information was accessible and transparent. It's a very, very different mindset. And here are a few facts just thinking about millennials. 29% say they expect to work regular office hours. It's a little bit different. They value kind of the development and work-life balance are more important today than, say, kind of the financial reward or compensation. Those are important too, but less so relative to some of the other values. I think the technology inside companies has largely flattened communication. And this, the way I think about this is if you think about an org structure, a hierarchy, it solves a number of different challenges. But one of those challenges is if you're in a company and you want to know, you need some information or want some help doing something or need to find an expert in some aspect of the business, how do you find that person without the internet? And you ask your manager, who asks the manager, who then disseminates information. So hierarchy is actually a really good tool for finding the right person. And with email, internet, technology, search, et cetera, it's become less important. Flexibility for millennials is much more important, and a greater focus on results versus, let's say, tenure. I think some of these may seem obvious, but I know when I put them all together, it's like this is a dramatic change that's happening in the workplace, and I think we're really at the beginning of it. So let's talk a little bit about the social experiment at Gilt. When we started this in January of 2012, we weren't actually smart enough to call it a social experiment, but it's become the label that's resonated most because it is an experiment in how we manage engineering. It was inspired mostly by our looking at companies like Netflix, which has a great culture, a great document on their culture, some amazing insights there. There's some links at the end that if you haven't seen it, just an amazing presentation. And from Amazon and looking at what they did around, say, 2 pizza teams, which are teams should be sized so that they can be fed from 2 pizzas. And if you need more than 2 pizzas, the team is too big. And Amazon also did this thing called a fitness function, which is talked about a little bit less, but it was a way to measure how the teams were doing. So is the team healthy or not, and therefore enable management by exception as opposed to management by default. And so largely the social experiment at Gilt was, can we pivot at Gilt to empower small teams to autonomously innovate and deliver value? And we'll go into how we did that. So let's look at a traditional org, and this is how we operated at Gilt for many, many years, and it works. So basically, somebody has an idea. Anybody in the company can have an idea. It turns out that actually people have lots of ideas. We're good at ideas. And then we start organizing those ideas maybe based on impact. So what's the ROI of an idea, or how big is this idea? What's the potential? And we end up with this really long backlog. At Gilt, we then created these things called swagathons, where we all got together and we swagged the ideas and the revenue impact, and end up with this big list. And then somebody in senior management takes the biggest idea and says, team, go build this. And 6 months later, the team goes and starts working on it. 6 months after that, the market's changed, the idea is no longer relevant. And we forget that actually the mistake was that we picked the idea a year ago, and we kind of lose that feedback loop because it took too long. I think if we think about startups, this works great, because largely in a startup, there is one idea. Our friend Shan is changing wedding registries and has this awesome idea for doing it. It's going to be great. She's there in the corner if you want to talk to her. And it's one idea. And so you don't really have this backlog, and you don't really have to manage. You have one idea, and you're going to execute on the idea. Over time, as more and more ideas come in, we start to introduce, it starts to feel like a challenge. Like, are we working on the right things? What are the things that we should be working on? And ultimately, it leads to this feeling that actually we're not getting anything done. One of the companies I talked to, who is, I haven't met anyone here from this company, but they will remain unnamed, is they said their current backlog is 18 months. And that's not even 18 months to work and release a product or a feature or try something. That's 18 months to even get something near the top of the backlog so that you can even start to think about prioritizing it. And that's a long time. And I think the key point here is that we ran into these problems at Gilt, and we were trying to solve those problems through the social experiment. And we think at this point, we're a year and a half in. I think the takeaway is we think it's working, and so kind of wanted to share what we did. There were some symptoms that really were clear that we had a problem. And one is that we spent lots of time talking about ideas that never got done. That's frustrating. We didn't feel great about the ideas that we were building. And so as engineers, as critical thinkers, working on something, but you don't actually believe that it's the best thing that the company can be doing, demoralizing. And it just feels slow. You feel like a large, slow-moving business. And largely, we were about 4 years old, and I'm estimating 800 people. It's not an actual, I don't know, it's within the ballpark. So we were already I think, a decent-sized organization. And I just point this out as I think this worked. I think this is working for Gilt, but there was a really concrete set of problems that we were trying to solve that led us down this road. And in exchange, I think we've solved these problems. We have some new problems as all things go. And one thing we really focused on is this notion that ideas actually are cheap in many cases. Occasionally somebody has a breakthrough idea, but it's exceptionally rare. And really what matters is execution. And there's this great quote which really says, innovation is often confused with just having an idea. But innovation is, of course, having the idea and doing everything else. The R&D, the testing, the redesigning to develop a new product, service, process, and then successfully getting it out to the market or putting it into use that is not just an idea, but an applied result. And all that other stuff is a lot of work. And we wanted to focus on execution. So here's a quote from Paul Graham. It's usually the execution that matters. And this was definitely true at Gilt. And so what we were really thinking hard about is, can we change, as an organization, who gets to decide what we execute? And this is how many people have not heard of Scrum? Scrum, I will say I'm not the biggest fan of Scrum in general, although I think there's some really good ideas in there. And from Scrum, we have this notion of chickens and pigs. And one way to think about chickens and pigs, and really chickens are kind of observers of a project, and pigs are the people that really have skin in the game. So question, in a bacon and egg breakfast, what's the difference between the chicken and the pig? Answer, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. So what we wanted to do at Gilt is really to give the pigs the ability, the power, the authority to choose what they build. And the first question we ran into was, how can individual teams and people make decisions that forward the corporate strategy? You can imagine now a dozen teams making independent decisions, and they may be working on things that the fear is they'll be working on things that are not relevant to our business, not making e-commerce better, not providing more product for our members. And we approached that by doing kind of two things in parallel. And one was we focused a lot on culture, and I hate talking about culture because I think the word is overused, but I'll give some very specific examples. And part of that was really to build in an expectation of mistakes and the notion that we will iterate quickly. And the second is key performance indicators, and we'll spend a lot of time today on KPIs. In terms of expecting mistakes, one of the success stories is we had an engineer working on a project, and the project was going great in terms of kind of its metrics and how it was doing for the business, but some people were upset with some aspect of what he was doing. And in a room, probably the larger audience than this internal, somebody asked, well, how can you be doing this because this partner of ours is really, really upset? And he said, because in our culture, we ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And that's what I'm doing right now. And within a few days, he had worked with the vendor and restored everything, and the vendor was happy, and we were happy, and we kept moving. But it was critical to allow the company to embrace that and say, yes, we value this because he shipped a product in a few weeks' time, which would have otherwise taken months to build consensus around. So let's talk about KPIs and key performance indicators. And when we first got into this, I used to think that KPIs were simple. A key performance indicator fundamentally is just something that you decide is important and that you may choose to measure. So, and we'll go through some actual examples for KPIs that we use at Gilt. In actuality, find that in practice they are very, very complex. And it often takes months of debate to actually agree on a KPI. And the debate is actually what's really important because it forces us, it enables us to be able to have a conversation about what really matters and do that before we've actually built anything or invested in anything. So at a time when it's cheap to iterate and pivot. So as an example, this has worked so well at Gilt that I've been starting to introduce KPIs at home. I'm married, I have 2 little boys, 7 and 4, and they're great family, great kids, but sometimes we find as parents that maybe we yell a little bit too much, particularly with our 4-year-old. And so we're thinking about introducing a KPI, which is how many times in the last 30 days has either mommy or daddy yelled at our children. And now we can have the debate over, well, why are we yelling? Is it something that we need to adjust? Is it actually important? Do we think actually this is actually, if we're doing it twice a month, this is actually good for the development of the child? And we're having a real discussion because we're talking about measuring something. And it really takes out all of the other ambiguity and allows, as humans, us to have an intellectual debate that's meaningful and real before we've actually done something hard like change our behavior. So that experiment is just starting, by the way. I don't know how it's going to work out. Here's an example from Gilt. So, and this is from our first pass at this. Part of our strategy a year and a half ago was to increase members of Gilt Group through organic search. Seems simple. In Gilt's particular case, we're a private site, so you can't see anything until you register. And we never invited Google to register, so the bots don't see anything. So actually, organic search is kind of interesting. And that feature of Gilt is important because part of our promise to brands is that the reason you're getting a great deal and a great product is it's available for only 36 hours. And then next month, if you search for a particular product, you won't be able to do any price analysis or even know that it was on sale on Gilt. It's very discreet. So this ended up actually being something, it's an interesting problem to solve in the context of a private sale business. Some of the KPIs, these are actually the 2 what we call strategic KPIs that we landed on. And the first was the number of users acquired in the past 30 days via non-branded organic search. I think it took 2 months to get to this point. And everything was, so non-branded means if somebody types Gilt into Google and they come to Gilt, we don't count them. It's if they type, I'm looking for a black dress or Christian Louboutins, which Gear and I both got to know very, very well at Gilt. They are a very, very desirable shoe, which for engineers means lots of traffic. So if somebody types that in and they register through Gilt, that's the traffic that we want to capture. Right? We want to get better at that. And the second was we had an idea that maybe some people will be already members and they'll search for something and realize that actually it's on sale today at Gilt and I can buy it at Gilt, and we call that session revenue. So these were the 2 strategic KPIs. And really, again, the important part was just to have the debate before we built anything to focus on what do we actually care about. And then comes the really, really important step, and this is hard. This was a year of work and a year to go through the cultural change within the organization. Once the KPIs are defined, for any of this to work, for any of this to enable decentralization, if we come back to the original hypothesis, to enable autonomy, management has to shift to manage the KPI, where it is and where it's going, and forget about the details. And this is really the critical step. And I think a couple examples here. So, and really what we're talking about is how do we enable empowerment in an organization where oftentimes seniority dictates what gets done. And we're talking about taking that decision making for what gets done and giving it to the teams, and how do we do that? And the trick is really the trick that to manage by KPI and to stop managing the individual ideas that the teams execute on. So as an example, the CEO tends to be a pretty important figure. We have a great CEO. If the CEO stops by a team's desk and says, I think we should do X, a lot of times the team will stop what they're doing and go work on the thing that the CEO thinks is the most important. KPIs are actually a tool that the teams can use to make sure that actually our strategy is organic search. These are our 2 KPIs, and the ideas that we're working on are going to move our KPIs. Your idea sounds great, but it doesn't move our KPIs. And that's a hugely powerful tool. And the second is around decision making. And really, when we free up the team, when we're not worried about the tactics, the how, and we're just worried about the what, the metric and how it's moving, it's just the team that makes the decision on what they're building. And that's it. There is no longer consensus building or meetings to go align on, do you think this is a good idea or what's the risk? No, you just go do it. And then you measure it, and you're done, and that's it. And it seems simple, but it is, the KPI is really the tool or the shield or however we want to describe it. It is the management tool that allows us to keep focused on, are we moving in the right direction of what matters, while granting the autonomy to the individual teams. So here are a few kind of lessons learned or questions that also came up from the team as we were doing this. One was that it actually is really important that the set of KPIs rolls up to the overall strategy. And so that becomes a management task. It's like we have a strategy. What are the important elements of the strategy? Let's fight that out, identify KPIs. For most of them, we're measuring. There's a few KPIs in there that aren't measuring. One question that came up, one of our great engineers, Mark Wunsch, gave a talk at Recon about removing locks in an organization and comparing this approach to kind of locks in software. It's like anytime you need an approval to do something is a lock. So just decentralization removes the lock so you can do more in parallel. Great talk. And he got asked, who does the shit work, right? All the teams are choosing what they work on and doing that stuff. So there's nobody left to do the work that nobody wants to do. And actually, the answer turns out that there isn't any more of this work, because either the work is important and moves a KPI, or actually it doesn't get done. But if it was important, why wouldn't we why wouldn't we have a KPI, right? So the teams, even if you think about repeatable work, maybe that's not as interesting, if that work is moving your KPI, it is the #1 project that the teams want to work on, and they go work on it, and they do it enthusiastically. It's awesome, right? It doesn't matter the type of work. If you're moving your metric and having an impact on the business, like, that's great work. And in some cases, it's easy to choose KPIs that conflict. And so to the extent, what we'd really try to do is to minimize those KPIs. So let's say one team's working on organic search, and one team is working on, here's the top 20 brands in the world that we're not yet selling on Gilt. Let's get them on Gilt. You can see there's a little bit of a conflict there. If those brands want total discretion, but now we have organic search, there's going to be a little bit of competition, potentially, on the ability to move the KPIs forward. So in general, we just try to minimize that so the teams can work independently. And in cases where there is overlap, the teams are just aware, and they just work together. It turns out that in practice, thinking about the conflict potentially in advance just makes this a complete non-issue. OK, so now I want to shift a little bit. So that was, I'd say, a little bit kind of more abstract or theoretical. And I want to talk a little bit about how exactly we implemented this at Gilt. And we'll talk at Gilt about initiatives, KPIs, teams, ingredients, and management. So let's start with initiatives. So we really start with the corporate strategy. And then we take that corporate strategy and we define it as a set of initiatives. An initiative is roughly a project or an area of focus that we intend to work on for the foreseeable future. And for us, foreseeable means longer than 3 months. In practice, it's turned out to be, I think 6 to 12 has been kind of the average lifetime of these initiatives. And then on a quarterly basis, we can evaluate the initiatives and decide if there's an area we want to keep investing in. So for example, organic search, within 2 months, we could see how it was doing. 6 months into it, it's doing really well. 1 year into it, it essentially was doing great, but you can see the growth slowing. And we decided to put that initiative on hold or in maintenance and move on and do something new. So we can evaluate the initiatives on a quarterly basis. And then an interesting thing is to have each team work on exactly one initiative. And this, at least for us, is a huge change. Because rather than trying to do, say, 40 different things, we just narrowed it down and said, OK, we have 10 teams. Let's do 10 things. We're going to do 10 things really, really well. And we'll say no to 30 other things. It's a really hard thing to say no. But when you do that, you end up finding, you find out that maybe you really wish you could do the 11th thing, but you just don't have a team that can really do a good job. So you make the decision, we're going to do a great job on the 10 areas which we think are most impactful for the business. From the initiatives, we then create KPIs. First time around, I think the teams created their own KPIs. All future rounds, the management created the strategic KPIs. I think it actually worked out a little bit better, at least the starting point for the KPIs. And really, each initiative is defined in terms of 1 to 2 strategic KPIs. And this is when, as a company, we can come together and think, do we have the right set of initiatives? Can we agree on how we're going to measure whether or not we're successful or not in each of these initiatives? And as a goal, we try to define a single strategic KPI. In some cases, we'll end up with 2. I don't think we've ever had more than 2. And then teams will essentially self-align to KPIs that they're interested in or initiatives they're interested in. And a lot of times what we see is as they create specific projects, those teams may create their own KPIs, which we call tactical KPIs, that are maybe more responsive, move faster, or are more specific to a particular project that they're working on. And so it's kind of faster feedback for what they're actually building. But at the end of the day, management is looking at the strategic KPIs and how those are moving. Teams. They tend to be 4 to 10 cross-functional team members. Again, this is the 2-pizza team approach. The teams with 10 people don't eat a lot each. It works out. I think there's 1 large team. The rest are kind of closer to the 4. In general, in theory, the team members select the initiatives that they work on. In practice, that ends up being a little bit harder because different teams may be coming off at different times. But in general, you find that people are interested in different areas of the business and just align to those areas. We found that teams tend to outlive the initiatives. So one team ends up becoming a pretty cohesive unit and will go tackle an initiative and then move on to another initiative. And in general, we found that our teams wanted to stay together. And then we do encourage mobility. So we do want people to move around and join other teams as it helps just nice to know the people you're working with in a broader context and also just encourages the sharing. And so we encourage mobility, but currently, at Gilt at least, we leave it up to the individuals to do that. Some of the other companies, I think it might be Etsy, they actually, after a year, they force people to move to a different team to really make sure that people are getting to know each other and sharing the knowledge. So there might be something to watch there. And then this was something we called ingredients, and it actually took a long time to come up with this, and I think it actually is really simple and makes a lot of sense. So in most organizations, people have titles, and titles could be things like product manager, developer, QA engineer, project manager, UX designer, visual designer, et cetera. People have titles. And generally, you start looking at a team, it's like, I need a product manager, I need a UX designer, I need a QA person, and you start building the team that way. And what we found is that actually what we really value is the skill and the interest that people bring in one of these areas. What we don't value are people's titles. I think the company that does this best, by the way, I think is Gore Industries. They make Gore-Tex. They're an awesome, awesome company. And everyone's title is team member. And people just figure out which team members are good at different things, and they kind of self-organize. They also limit their locations to 150 people based on Dunbar's law, which says humans are pretty good at managing about 150 relationships, but not much more. And so they put those two things together to really encourage kind of this ingredient approach to building teams. To come back here, what we do is for each team that's working on an initiative, we want to make sure that every one of these ingredients is satisfied. And so as you start building the team, you start looking if, let's say the engineer has a great product sense, then the engineer can check off the box on, write code, product vision, maybe product strategy. And you check those boxes. And now you have to augment the team with the ingredients that are missing. Other teams you have an engineer who is just phenomenal at writing code, only thing they're interested in, doesn't test anything, doesn't care about UX, and so you augment, maybe you pull somebody from the UX team who's a specialist because they fit, because there's a real need on that team to have that particular skill. It ends up being a really nice model, because as the teams form, rather than having kind of by default all these people on the team, what you end up with is the initial team starts forming and they're like, oh my gosh, in order to execute, I'm going to need X. I better go find somebody and convince them to join my team. And then you're being recruited to say, you're just awesome. Because one UX engineer, for example, is just amazing, and everybody's always like, we really need you. And what a great position to be in. Like, it is a skill that's absolutely valued and basically sets up that person or that ingredient for success on that team from the beginning. In the ideal world, every team has every ingredient. In practice, there are limits. And so what we try to do there is just at least identify that these are the ingredients that are missing. And then it's kind of the rest of the organization and management's responsibility to help fill in or either, or solve the problem in some way, or acknowledge that we're going to have a gap because we don't have this ingredient on the team. And now at least we can be aware of it and ultimately avoid frustration is I think where we end up. Here's just kind of a graphic that kind of shows that, team 1 here, you've got 5 people on the team. They're working, the things on the left are repos. So they may have 2 Git repositories that they've created that they're working in. The little bubbles next to the people are the ingredients that those people bring. And in team 1, they've moved on to their second initiative. Team 2, 4 people, same mix of ingredients. They're on their first initiative. Team 3, 6 people, they're on to their third initiative. Just kind of a visual of kind of the team structure, the ingredients, and how the teams may move over time to tackle different initiatives. And then I want to highlight, just as we close out tactics at Gilt, just kind of what management looks like. So in theory, in practice, what we do is we have a meeting. It's once every 2 weeks. The meeting has the same agenda. What's your KPI? How are you doing towards your targets? What are the current, we test everything, so what are the current tests you're running? What's the elevator pitch for the next few weeks? So if you think of one of these teams as basically an independent startup, if you will, within a larger context, it's like, what are you guys working on? What's the story? What's the 60-second pitch on why you think you're going to grow this part of the business or move your KPI? And we found that in practice, this works great when the KPIs are great. And by great KPIs, it means they're clear and they're responsive, where they actually can move within a week. In cases where the KPIs move very slowly, this is just a complete, utter disaster. It just doesn't work. It's kind of been a challenge. And so what we're trying to do is, over time, if the strategic KPI is something that doesn't move very quickly, then at least supplementing that with kind of fast-moving tactical KPIs, so that when we get together, we can look at that and estimate. But it's been this is one of those surprises for us where in theory thought this would work great, and in practice has been hard, although a year and a half into it seems to be getting better according to the team. Alex?
Who sets the target?
I'm sorry?
Who sets the targets?
The targets? So yeah, it's a good question. So in the targets are generally set together with the teams, but in practice there are always, so in practice what we're doing is that when we looked at organic search, we thought that we think there's a, whatever, $20 million revenue opportunity in organic search, let's say. And so we already have kind of an estimate at the high level of that if we were to go after this area, that's what the opportunity is. And we know it'll take an initiative team to go attack that opportunity. So there's some kind of cut at the top that helps us prioritize kind of the big, we want to go after organic search versus, let's say, search on the site. And then what happens is from there we get into the KPIs, and then we meet with the team. And the team thinks really hard around the KPIs and goes and sets the targets. And then once we come back with the targets, we go validate that, is it in the range of what we were thinking? And interestingly, on organic search, although it rolled up to about roughly the estimate, we thought we were going to acquire a lot of users and have almost no session revenue. And actually, the flip ended up being correct. Our models were completely wrong, but one was wrong in the negative way, one was wrong in the positive way, and they rolled up to the same thing. Which worked out great. And in a lot of this, one of the really nice things is we actually don't have to be right either, because we just acknowledge we're going to be wrong. And as soon as the team starts, we're making a small investment. As soon as we start measuring, we know. And from there, we can adjust. And so what could happen with very, very quickly, it'll happen definitely at 3 months, it could happen sooner, is if you get into it and you start measuring this thing and you realize that actually we totally blew it, you just abort and you change. But we've actually never had to do that. There's a link here if you find the deck later. John Quinn, who's just amazing, ex-Dig CTO and our current SVP of engineering, wrote up a nice blog post that talks more about kind of this particular approach. So started January, we're about 18 months in. One of the ways we kind of think about whether or not this social experiment itself was successful. It's like, what are the KPIs for the social experiment? We look at traditional metrics. We say retention is very high, especially among top engineers. And this is key. I mean, the market right now is amazing for tech talent. It's just amazing. And and this is one of the very specific things. Like we want to retain our best people, and the way we retain them is by making this a great place to contribute. So that's worked out. We like to say all of our charts are up and to the right. For the charts that are supposed to go up and to the right, they're up and to the right. And I think we've actually seen our pace of feature delivery. It's not something, this is subjective, we don't actually measure this, but it just seems to be increasing. And kind of the subjective measure is just watching stuff go out to members and the types of things we're doing. Like there's just, I mean, it's awesome. So I think the happy sums it up. OK, so let's come back to the hypothesis. So decentralization is the best way to scale today's engineering orgs. I'm going to think about this one other way, and this is something, so I learned from my father. He's a immigrant from Poland, came to America. I was 2, have an older sister. So the family of 4, $300, no job, no work permit, no family, nothing, granted asylum in '79. And now he's a successful serial entrepreneur, just sold his 8th company out in California. And I remember one day he was telling me a story at work. And by the way, he's a real engineer, none of this software stuff. He does like real science, like accelerometers and gyros etched on silicon. And you know, we talk about, oh, our compiler is slow. He's got a 2-week manufacturing cycle, and he's psyched. You know, he gets back chips, and they come back, and he's got to figure out, you know, oh, stiction. What the hell is stiction? It's when atoms stick together, and it's causing a problem in the readings on the accelerometer. So that's what he does. It's like real science. And I remember once he was telling me a story where he hired great engineers, and I remember 3 PhDs and 4 masters in the best universities in the world. And he knows the guy is making a mistake. And it's going to take 6 months, basically, to figure out that the path is wrong. My dad knows this. He's done it. And it turned out he was correct. And he's just like, you can't do anything about it, because you get to make a choice. And your choice is you can hire people, smart people who will listen to you, or you can hire smart and autonomous people. And he chose to hire smart and autonomous people. And when you choose to hire smart and autonomous people, they're going to be autonomous. And he basically said there's these 2 camps, broadly speaking, and both models will work. But if you hire from one, don't expect to be able to do the other. And somehow it's just really stuck with me as an example. And kind of we've erred on growing the engineering org in terms of hiring smart and autonomous people, and thus the need to decentralize to work in parallel. And thinking about smart and autonomous people, here's kind of a few things that I think they want. Authority to make project decisions is a big deal. Building something that matters is a really, really big deal. Impacting the business. Just met a great engineer who's built this wonderful boutique software engineering company. He's doing great. And he talks about the difference between working for, let's say, building some tooling for an internal application for a company versus launching a new startup. And some of his team members like building the internal tools because they know they will get used, and they can talk to the people and see how it improves their life and their productivity. It's a big, big deal. Earlier, we saw a slide where we said we were happy with the way this experiment has gone. We actually think a lot more that smart and autonomous people would suggest actually want to develop a strong sense of well-being. And well-being is more important than happiness. And the difference there is, so everybody would say, I want to be happy. But the reality is there are moments in life where we don't feel happy. And so well-being is really that place in your life where you can deal well with the negative times and come out of it strong, as well as appreciate the good times. So I think we really focus on smart and autonomous people really want to develop this strong sense of well-being, kind of personally in their families and at work. And I think everyone will say they want to work with great people. I've defined great as better than me. And that just comes from over time. I've always thought I've worked with great people. And every single year, I meet people who are just great and realize that actually maybe that person I thought was great 10 years ago, if only they had met this person is great. So define it as just better than me, and it seems to be never ending. I think values are really important too. So we won't talk too much about this, but it'll come up later in the value of trust. But being just brutally honest, humble. People talk about humility. I think of a lot of self-deprecation. Maybe over a drink we can talk about some embarrassing instances that happen in life and just being able to laugh at yourself and move on. Having respect. Transparency is a big one as well. So it's just not having to answer why are we doing this. The why should be obvious. And internally, one way of measuring transparency that we're considering having it done is actually to create a KPI around the number of times somebody is surprised and setting our target at 0. Because if we can hit that, we're really being transparent, doing a good job communicating, and actually it's a nice place to be. It's actually a good KPI for the family too. I think thinking about this hard, I think it boils right down to trust more than anything else. Just real trust. And so what is trust? Confidence in or reliance on some person or quality, if you believe Wiktionary. And if we think about trust in engineering, we trust our engineers to write software. We trust them to manage our systems, trust them to change our databases, the access to our most sensitive information if you are a company run by software. But then we have to ask, do we really trust engineering judgment? And that brings us quickly to short talk around policies. And arguably, every single policy within a corporate structure, every single approval is basically a source of friction and actually a source that erodes trust. So we were just talking earlier today and thinking about employee handbooks as one example. And why don't we have employee handbooks that simply are, use your best judgment. If you need help, just ask before you act. And why isn't that sufficient for managing an organization? So here's an example from a travel and entertainment policy. It really should be use your judgment. If unsure, ask in advance. And probably if we all looked and we're Gilt's in the same place, you can spend up to X dollars per day while you're traveling. Who can post to the company blog? The answer should be anybody. Probably it is something along the lines of if you want to send a draft, it'll be reviewed to make sure that it's on brand and all these other things. And these are two simple examples, but they erode trust. Right? Because we're saying specifically that we actually don't trust your judgment to make these decisions. And so, in fact, we're going to require management to help you. This came up when we launched the Gilt blog at tech.gilt.com. We had the initial reaction is like, before something goes live, have somebody approve it. Maybe your manager approves the post. And what we did is actually not do that. And what we said is, everybody in the company can post to the tech blog. We'd love for you to maybe consider peer review. Peer review works in the scientific community. Consider it before you post. Here's the password. The document actually has the password, although I don't trust you guys, so I masked it out. And that's it. And what became nice is then actually we have a list here of people who are willing to help. If you need help writing or copy editing or wordsmithing or whatever, there's an appendix with like a dozen people from around the company who volunteered to help. And they're there if you want them, and if not, you don't. This is great. This may or may not work out, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, because we're doing a peer-to-peer budgeting experiment. And so if you think about like teams, you want to go out maybe for dinner, or hey, you're doing a good job. Here's like $50. Go buy yourself a new shirt on Gilt. Even though Gilt's a fashion company, you can still dress like an engineer. And so how does this work? So it's like, oh, I think Joe is doing a great job. I go talk to my manager and say, can you please approve a $50 credit to Joe to recognize his performance on X? And so what happens? So nobody does this. It's too hard. There's friction. So what we're doing is we said, well, let's just take a budget for however many $1,000s per month we want to spend on this kind of thing. And we put in a Google spreadsheet. It's in the cell A1. And the way the process works is if you want to spend some of the money, you add a line, and you say what you're spending the money on and how much you're spending. And then it subtracts. And if it stays green, done. You go spend the money. If not, we're asking folks this month to just list the things that they would have liked to have done for which we don't have enough funds. And then we can consider getting, massaging the budget to get to the right point. So this is awesome. Like you want to take your friend, you want to give your friend a gift, you just go buy him a book, throw it on the thing, done. No approval, you made the decision, you did it, you recognize somebody. It's just awesome. And it's just, and if it works out, then we can start tying this to, what's the right appropriate level of funding for this type of program. And if we want to increase the funding, maybe we set ourselves a target in terms of growth in the business, hit that and feed that back in and do more. And all of a sudden it's, yeah, we went out for coffee, but we went out for coffee because we grew the business by another 10% last year, and that means we can go drink lattes instead of iced coffee or whatever. Yeah. But this is fun. I hope this works out. We're in month 2. In month 1, the budget was used in 1 day, I think, or maybe an hour. So we'll see. But it's totally awesome. All right, here's a couple links. I think the Valve Employee Handbook was on Hacker News today. People comparing the Valve culture to high school. I do think it's an inspirational handbook, though. Like, put the link here. Those are all things. There's pros and cons to everything. And here's the link to the Netflix culture document. And I think it's important that like, none of us get this right. If there was somebody who got this 100% right, then we would all be doing it the same way. And I think the reality is there are lots of different models, and so it's impossible to get right. So I want to shift gears a little bit and actually talk about technology itself. And so I think most traditional companies will write some software, and a lot of engineers will contribute to a single repository, or maybe 2 repositories, small number of repositories. And then there will be some testing, maybe, and then at some point a release will be cut, and at some point a release will be deployed to production. And especially in the beginning, this is always manual and it's time-consuming. And the important thing is that actually it's centralized. The decision to change production is no longer in the hands of the people creating the change, so in our world, the teams. It has become centralized because somebody has to make the change in production. And that's when you end up with like network operation centers and system administrators that are simply kind of copying code around and that sort of thing. Separation of responsibility, that you end up with all of those structures which actually provide I'd argue, no real value. So in order to actually get to a point where decentralization is possible, autonomy is possible, it actually requires a huge investment in technology. And in particular, there are 3 areas that we just identified. One is this notion of LOSA, which stands for lots of small applications. Something we call Ion Cannon, which is just our name for continuous delivery at Gilt. So continuous delivery is the idea that at any moment you can basically type a single command and it'll deploy to production. And platform as a service is something we call Galactica. So we'll touch on each of these. So lots of small applications, LOSA. If I had my laptop here, you would see a sticker on it that says LOSA. That's how you know it's real. It is a core part of our tech strategy. And it really comes from this observation that monolithic applications, or applications that have a large number of contributors, over time become complex. And that complexity surfaces in a number of different ways. But one of those ways is that if one of these applications gets slow, it takes a lot of work to figure out who even cares or should be notified. And so you end up building complex monitoring. You end up writing algorithms to figure out, well, this error occurred in this part of the code base, and I'll take the source code history and figure out that these are the last 3 people that committed code, and I'm going to email them those 3 people that maybe they caused the problem. And so we end up with kind of building all this complexity, and we end up using words like enterprise reporting and alerting and that sort of thing. So actually, there is a different way. And what we've been experimenting with is this notion of lots of small applications, which is basically, so you want to add a new feature? Great. Create a new Git repo, create a new JVM, create a new database. You want to add a table to our database? Great. Here's a brand new database. And really, if we think about it, the goals we're trying to solve for here are, 1, isolation, so that a team can go make a change safely, right? Because if there is an error, it'll just affect their application. And accountability, like if there's a problem, the team will know. My application is slow. Cart service is slow. That thing is slow. The product detail page is slow. It's not something else happening in the runtime. That's the only thing that thing does. The problem is there. It also leads to something at Gilt that we call lots of small errors, really. Stands for loser. Which is one of the consequences here, where if you think about Gilt, Gilt is actually in a state of constant error. Something is always broken, something's broken right now. But the teams are aware of it and they're fixing it, and either it's completely non-relevant or it's being fixed very, very quickly because it's easy. The team knows and it's easy, it's a small change, it's a small delta from the last change. And this chart, where you see kind of the slope of the line change, that's January 2012, which is really when we started the social experiment. And this just measures the number of unique applications at Gilt, where an application might include a Git repo for the database, a Git repo for the web app, a Git repo for a service tier, kind of just figuring out how many different unique applications. And kind of we just saw a nice uptick. Gary?
That's total over time?
I believe, yes, total over time.
What would it look like if I'm sure you deprecate things over time?
You know.
Okay.
Yeah.
That answers the question?
Actually, Blackbird is dead. Blackbird is something
Finally.
That it was created in 3 days' time, I think. When we introduced, it was a very trying time at Gilt. And it was an experiment in JRuby. And I think it took 4 years to kill Blackbird. But we actually had a project to remove the tech debt, and we turned it off finally, actually like a month ago.
Yeah, I mean, the question comes from, it sounds like it's very easy to replace something.
Yeah.
Like I have a better idea on how to do this small application,
Yeah.
but I guess that's a one-to-one trade.
Well, it is I think where we do see it, and one thing we're watching for long term is we have this proliferation of applications now. And that means that there are lots of applications that people don't care about anymore, right? It just sits there and it just runs, and nobody cares about it. And so whose job is it to upgrade it or fix it when it fails? And this is a problem. And what we hope is that at the time that that thing starts to really fail, it's either fixable because it's on a common stack of technology, or it's small enough that somebody can quickly replace it. Or it turns out that thing's not important, so you just shut it off and throw it away, and you get rid of this piece. But as a consequence, we do end up with clearly defined APIs between all the different services. It just falls out. And even, I think today on one of the pages of Gilt, basically every time you click on Gilt, you're actually going to a new Git repo with a new JVM, and but it's seamless, which is really nice. And if you think about it, if I don't like the product detail page on Gilt, I just create a new LOSA, and now you can A/B test it too, and you just kill one of the JVMs with the winner, and then you just keep moving. So it's nice. Netflix has a great, I think it's Netflix, has a great presentation as they went to this microservices type architecture. And one of their key takeaways was that, I think like Gilt, they overcorrected and just went new application for everything. And then over time, they started reeling that back in. And so they're learning kind of what is kind of where are the right boundaries. But one of the things that is just, I think apparent is it's actually easier to merge two services into one runtime than it is to take one runtime and decouple it into two services. So that's what we hope. We don't know. I think it's one of the big risks actually in this model. One other just comment on LOSA, it was kind of interesting. MongoDB is one of the databases that we use. And if you're familiar with MongoDB, one of the big features from between 2.0 and 2.2 was the introduction of locking at the collection level as opposed to a global lock. It actually had very little impact at Gilt because every Mongo database had one collection in it, basically, right, if you think about this. So that we just didn't care. We could have a simpler database and have it run well. Continuous delivery is kind of this other thing, getting a lot of attention right now. I think this year from the open source community is just amazing to watch continuous delivery and deployment, I think, rise. It's just awesome. But basically, the idea is to enable safe, simple, automated production deploys. And where we ended up is we're basically an all Scala type safe shop these days. And we use SBT, which started as a simple build tool until people realized that maybe it's not so simple and called it the Scala build tool. But you can type SBT release in any one of your applications, enter, and then within a few minutes, your application will be safely deployed to production. And basically, the way continuous delivery, what we do with continuous delivery is we have a very simple spec. It's a text file that says, here are all the tests to run. They can be unit tests, they can be integration tests, they could be Selenium tests. They could be, where's Andrew? Andrew's here. Andrew worked on our data engineering team at Gilt, and he now works at AppNexus. He's a great guy. He used to get really pissed off when people would upstream from data warehouse, would make changes that would then days later break the data warehouse. It's just a horrible problem. So what the data engineering team does at Gilt today for applications they care about, they just contribute tests. And they just gently put in, here's the command I want you to run to make sure that my stuff is going to work. And continuous delivery guarantees that all of those tests will run before the artifact is promoted to even be eligible to go into an environment or production. And one of kind of organizationally the theory, and I think it's working, is we emphasize automated testing here and basically created this notion of what we call fast track and slow track in continuous delivery, which I think is emerging as a pretty standard practice. And the idea is that fast track is 100% automated tests, and that's what we prefer. And teams that create repositories with good test coverage can use fast track to deploy their stuff to an environment. Teams that do not do that have to go through slow track, and slow track is basically a normal daily. You queue up for slow track, we deploy it to the integration environment, people look at it, if everything looks good, gets a green light at the end of the day, and then those versions of those applications can go into fast track to get deployed to production. So what we did organization is say, this awesome way for you to release your code, and you can do it whenever you want, as frequently as you want, whenever you want, and it's automated and safe, but you have to write automated tests to enable that, and it's been great in terms of just increasing quality of the code. We also, in terms of KPIs, to come back, for all this stuff, the KPI we use to measure the success of these programs is what we call voluntary adoption, which is very similar to kind of how the open source world works. Like if you like a project, you use it. If the project is not great, you don't use it. And in this case, the continuous delivery system came from the architecture team and is measured by, are people adopting the system or not? It's a much better motivator than saying, you have to use this thing, even though I know you hate it, you have to use it. It's like, no, you don't. We have this thing, it makes your life better, use it. If not, I would love to work with you to see if we can make it better, but it's up to the team to adopt it, which puts pressure on, I think it puts the right incentive on the teams working on tooling to build great tools. And Galactica, this is something we're now, I think, gaining momentum on. Really hard, but basically I think about this as Heroku for the enterprise. How can we make it that simple for people within an organization to provision capacity in production that they need when they need it? And so we're working on this. I think there's also a lot of interesting projects going on. I think if you've heard of, there's OpenStack, which is pretty well established. Now there's CloudStack, which is an Apache project, which I think is great. You've probably heard of Docker, which is kind of wrapping Linux containers. So there's a lot of kind of innovation happening in the open source world around making it easier to do something like this internally. But essentially the idea here is when you do release, you should just be provisioning new hardware on demand, deploying to that new stuff, give the teams control over the load balancers. They can have their own load balancers and pivot traffic without any centralization. So today at Gilt, this is actually still centralized. There's a lot of automation around it, but it's still centralized, and we're trying to move it to a world where it is just up to the teams. And then you can imagine giving the teams a budget. You guys get 20 grand a month to run your stuff. You guys get 100 grand a month to run your stuff. And when the team runs out of budget, now you can have a discussion. Like that's the management discussion. The things we're doing is really valuable. Do we want to invest? Are we spending too much, too little, et cetera? So I hope we get there. Just in terms of tech infrastructure, I think one of the things we learned is that this is a big investment. I mean, all of these things, the automation, LOSA, the continuous delivery, platform as a service. But in general, regardless of autonomy and decentralization, they make the technology better. They make the software we're writing more robust. It improves quality. And I think that was, I don't think we expected that. Maybe we did, I don't remember. But it's just kind of independent of everything else. Like this investment just makes complete sense. Yeah, and I think ultimately you see people are happier, greater well-being, higher productivity. I mean, people are fundamentally happier. It's just like, yeah, we have one guy in Dublin, his name is Gregor, and he's just like, SBT release, smile on his face. I had an app, I used to release it every night for like a month because it was just awesome to watch the machine work. So as we kind of start to wrap up, I just want to touch on innovation. We didn't really talk too much about innovation today explicitly, but actually this whole talk is really about innovation if you think about it. And looking around the industry, I haven't met anybody who's figured out how to create innovation. If you're here, please share. But I would argue that we have figured out how to kill innovation. Like that seems pretty clear. And so really, if you think about kind of decentralization, autonomy, empowerment, it's really about, I think one of the benefits is to create an environment that allows for innovation to occur. So we'll see, hard to measure, but I don't know, I think it's actually a critical element. If people are empowered to make their own decisions and to work all night, deploy stuff to production whenever they want, do it from a coffee shop. I heard 70 decibels of ambient noise helps the brain, the creative part of the brain. So yeah, and that's it. So just back to the hypothesis that decentralization is the best way to scale today's engineering orgs. And love to take any questions if you guys have them. Yeah.
Going into what you said earlier about allowing smart autonomous individuals to make changes that are meaningful to the business, what challenges can you come up with in terms of making sure that the technology people understand the business? And has that been more of an investment than the meaningful?
Great question. I think if I just restate, it's so how do we make sure that the technology people on the teams are aware enough of the business to be making good decisions for the business? Yeah, and it's, I would say the leaders of the team emerge from the team. And if there isn't a natural leader on a team, it's a problem. And that comes back to the ingredients on the team. And so it's not that everybody at Gilt or it's not that every member, let's say everyone who writes code cares about the business. Some people do, some people don't. But we do make sure that there's somebody like that, whether they come from a background in product management, software development, or one of the other ingredients, that they bring that element to the team. And then to a certain extent, we have to hire for it as well. And arguably, I mean, I think if I think about our teams, one of the things I love is that the leaders of our teams are going to be the best tech founders for the next generation of tech in New York. It's an amazing environment to learn, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're learning. Yeah, and so I think it's in practice kind of worked out. But hiring, there's maybe some mentoring when we don't have the right ingredient, but then finding the right people who are interested and passionate about it. And again, it just varies based on their background.
Hi, I was just wondering, you were talking about how a group could be working on an initiative, and then when it finishes, they go find something else. I'm wondering, how do they know about the initiatives? Like, are they just listed out somewhere, or is it something that's everyone has a meeting for every so often? Yeah, and so in terms of how do teams find out about the initiatives themselves, so initiatives they last a long time. And so really, it turns out that we'll end up doing an all-hands meeting. It's like, here is the strategy, here are the initiatives, and it's like, yeah, that's what they are. And then what we ended up doing is, in terms of the KPIs and the awareness of the KPIs, one of the teams, a couple people got together and they wrote kpi.gilt.com. So you type that in, and it's a Play app, and it has all the people's KPIs. And if you want to set your targets or see what teams are working on, it's actually, the database is a Google document per team. And so you just go to the spreadsheet and you enter in the values, and it gets graphed over time. So I'd say the initiatives are actually slow changing, so easy to know. The KPIs were harder, and we just ended up building a lightweight app just to socialize the KPIs, which is, yeah, it's great, and built in the tooling that we use, because otherwise it's. Yeah. Question?
Hi, I was wondering, what were the building blocks that you think you had in place that enabled you to roll out these changes that scaled your tech organization, whether on the people front, so like the KPI stuff, or on the tech front? To what extent those were reactive versus proactive, and if they were reactive, then what allowed them to succeed? Yeah, so I think the answer is everything was proactive because we're perfect planners. Trying to think back. I would say to answer a slightly different question, maybe addresses it. I think the piece that we completely underestimated was the transition of the culture to actually respecting that the teams had the autonomy to make the decision. And yeah, I think we just completely underestimated how hard that transition was going to be. And had we done it, and we talked today, like I wish I had this talk like a year and a half ago to say, hey, here are the problems that we're having. We think a solution to this is something that we're going to call an experiment, and here is how we're going to execute it. But so in terms of the actual teams, I think the ingredients are something that was reactive, and that came from one of the teams where initially we put a product manager and kind of a senior software engineer, and the senior software engineer and the product manager were just fighting all the time because they just disagreed on the product vision, and they both had great vision, and that didn't work. And so in reaction to that, we kind of looked at it and said, this doesn't make sense. We have people with competing skills. Let's see if we can find a way to formalize it. So I'd say the ingredients were definitely reactive. With KPIs, turns out that we now think that it's okay not to measure every KPI. Or to think about it differently, measure every KPI, but acknowledge the uncertainty in the measurement. And there's always a lot of debate around that. Like the KPI by itself has a lot of value, even without the measurement. And if we can't measure it, then just guess, but just say we're guessing is kind of a recent learning. I think early on we spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how to measure something, and the measurement's actually less important. What else? The transition, lots of small applications is a gamble. We're still early. We'll see if the debt long-term is manageable or if it's kind of overwhelming. We think it's going to be manageable, but it's a risk. Thanks.
Roughly.
Hi, how's it going, Michael? It's a really cool presentation. I really like the lots of small applications, but it seems like one of the points you made was that a lot of this kind of autonomy is expensive from a technology standpoint. You make a lot of technology investment. How much would you say Gilt's engineering organization is kind of like overhead to support the product engineering organization, and how have you justified it to kind of the rest of the executive team that we need to invest 30% of our engineers in supporting our other engineers?
Yeah, so great question, David. Before I answer that, will you share your wedding vows with this group?
Will I share my wedding vows with this group?
Yes, they're amazing.
Well, Michael was recently at my wedding, and I told my wife one of the things that I've learned is that oftentimes in computers, if you just restart everything, it usually fixes the problem. And I told her that, anytime as we run into issues, remember that we can always restart to that moment that I shared the vows. So that was my learning, not from Gilt, but
she still said yes. Yeah, great wedding. So I would say, and we don't really think about it anymore in terms of overhead necessarily. So something that I've struggled with my entire life at Gilt, even when Gary and I were there working together, is that we have an architecture team, but the architecture team is always building things for the members and not really building core architecture. And so that's not really, it's kind of a small, I'd say the architecture team at Gilt is small. There's maybe, I don't know, 2, 3 people now focused on, I'd say, tooling, out of, say, 100 people writing code, kind of that order of magnitude. The infrastructure team at Gilt, so kind of system administration and DevOps, what we call zero weighting operations, like true self-service. And that whole team is like 7 or 8 people. And so if you kind of think about it in that sense, it's actually a pretty small percentage of people devoted to kind of the tooling. That said, we don't have enough, and so we're actually building out a team right now. And the measure is, for us, is if we look at the teams and ask them, what percentage of your time are you wasting on infrastructure and tooling instead of doing work that you think is meaningful? Today that number is probably 20% of their time, maybe 25, like it's high. And so now we're at a point where, yeah, it makes sense. We have to invest more, we got to do a better job. And Etsy is another company that they have a team just working on what they call kind of DevOps and tooling, and they're doing a great job. And I think they've probably invested more than any other company I've met. And I think if you ask them, they would say that the ROI on that is absolutely there because of the increase in productivity and happiness.
Very cool.
My questions kind of relate to that, and I was just wondering, what sort of communication technologies do you use amongst like team members? Like, how do you kind of keep things sort of like ratified, and like, like for instance, like how do you make KPIs available? Like, what strategies do you have for that?
So strategies for facilitating communication among the teams and say the company.
Or like technological like tools, like do you have like an IRC channel or like some like in-house solution or something like that? Or?
Yeah. So it's one of the, I think it's an NP complete problem, actually. We started on Skype, and about every year somebody tries to replace Skype with something better. So we've tried, I don't know, I think we've tried everything at this point. Actually, Monday was actually my birthday, and one of the great engineers at Gilt finally moved the entire company, or entire tech group, to HipChat on Monday. It was amazing. So now we're on HipChat. We did a pilot with Yammer earlier, and I think today, if we're starting a company from scratch, probably, I think Yammer is actually, it was kind of amazing, particularly for people who like Facebook. I mean, it was just amazing to flatten out kind of all the communication around. But in general, in terms of communication, the thing that we're really starting to centralize on just now is peer review. And the way we do peer review is we have a single mailing list, tech-RFC, and we ask people to just send an RFC when they start working on something. And then it's ultimately their responsibility to manage it. And recently, the architecture team has started actually weekly reviewing all the RFCs to make sure that somebody outside the organization is kind of aware and give feedback. And we're now starting to think about doing RFC not just for technical design, but really user experience design, visual design, et cetera, so that we can kind of use peer review to kind of do the norming and communication. And then the last thing that we're thinking about, and I'd say kind of right now optimistic, although we haven't actually implemented it, is actually putting a KPI in place back to surprises, like measuring. So if we do something or somebody does something and somebody is surprised, they just +1, I got surprised, and that's a bad thing. We don't want surprises to happen.
and thinking about actually, before we really do too much here, what is the KPI that we're after so we can start measuring it so that we will know that are we actually getting better or not. But in terms of specific technology, we've Skyped for a really, really long time. We're now on HipChat. We actually figured out, we put a REST API on top of a service that ran Skype so we can have an API to post messages into the Skype chat room, which is really, really hard to do. And it ran for months without failure. And then we switched to HipChat, and they have a REST API. It's perfect. So that service died.
Good evening. I'm Victoria. I was wondering, how do you integrate a new member onto a team so that they're better able to contribute meaningful to the KPIs?
Yeah. So onboarding new members, I would say we're horrible at it. And it's basically trial by fire. It's not an area that we've invested in at all. A few people, as they've joined, they've left artifacts like makefiles that build most of the stuff. What we are starting to do is last week we ran our first Scala training session on site for a couple days. And so employees, engineers who joined recently went to that. It was also open to the public. So we had a few people join from outside. And so kind of bringing some of the training on site. And then we have a few of the engineers have gotten together to create an initiative around making it easier. So we're actually creating a problem set that people can do to learn the technology stack at Gilt. But today it's trial by fire and embarrassingly poor at it.
Thank you.
But it's actually worked. I don't know, how are we on time? Do we have, I don't know if there's maybe one more question, or how do we look? Yep.
Hi, I have a question about decentralization and autonomy. It seems like a good way to win a lot of small battles with kind of more individual teams and guerrilla tactics, but how do you ensure more long-term monolithic vision for the company to stay ahead of what's over the horizon and beat, everyone else?
Yeah, it's a good question. So is there a fear of kind of micro-optimization? And yeah, I think it definitely happen. I think it happens in any structure. So I don't think it's a unique aspect of the structure. One piece that is happening now that's very, very nice is that some of the teams, they don't really actually care what their KPI is, right? They'll do enough so their KPI moves, and then they're going and building the thing that's going to fundamentally change the business for the better. And to a certain extent, we're seeing kind of that organic creation of disruption within the company, to the point that even today, so one of the questions asked is, how cannibalistic is this idea that this team is working on? Like, is it something that really could disrupt the business? So to a certain extent, I think it's helped in that innovation can come from the teams. It doesn't have to be top down. And then second is actually, it just comes back to the corporate strategy, and we do centralize the corporate strategy, right? That is a central effort. It is the senior team at Gilt creating the strategy and the vision for the company. And if we get that right, that's where kind of the big vision comes, and that, what are we going to do to make sure that we grow meaningfully over the next kind of few years. It comes from that. And I think internally we talk about, there is no perfect system. Pure centralization has problems. Pure decentralization has problems. Our strategy really, especially in the engineering side, is we're going to err on decentralization and then choose carefully when we centralize for the right reasons. And that would be an example of where we've kept centralization.
Cool, thanks.
Well, thank you very much. This was great.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Again, this is our last. We're going to take a pause for the summer. We'll see you in September.